Chadacre Plampins seem to weave through our early history. We feel sure now that our Plampins are related to them. This episode explores Chadacre Hall and its stories more fully. This episode is a little longer than usual, as we have the benefit of many more records linked to Chadacre Hall. There was an influx of apothecaries from France to England around the Norman invasion of 1066. Many went to London, where there were the greatest opportunities for customers, but the second most popular destination was Bury St Edmund in Suffolk, which was booming due to the wool trade. Records show the Plampin Apothecary was situated at Cook's Row, Bury St Edmund. Records also show that from the 1600s, the Chadacre Plampins soon acquired land around the area, suggesting their apothecary business was doing well. Buying land was the primary way to build one's social standing. The Plampins started off with purchases of land at Brockley, Hardtest, and Long Melford. They then bought, at last, the 1,200-acre Chadacre Hall estate at Shimpling, which they made their primary family seat. But they also had a substantial house by the Abbey and churchyard in Bury St Edmunds. This was probably a logistical necessity, as at the time the Abbey provided medical care much like a hospital. We can presume that much of the Plampins' apothecary work supported the Abbey Hospital. Chadacre Hall was a prestigious property with a long history. The book, The Manners of Suffolk, notes Chadacre Hall was mentioned 982 years ago in King Edward the Confessor's time, as being gifted to Ulric, who was an invading Danish earl. Edward the Confessor had ended the Danish rule of England in 1044. We can suppose this gift of land to a Danish earl was an attempt to forge collaborations with the previous rulers of England to secure peace and mutual benefit. These gifts of significant pieces of lands were very common in English history, a land that experienced waves of invasion. Somehow, a way was needed to pay off the vanquished people so that they would accept the new invaders and not raise armies against them. Land has always been valuable, prized, and a good alternative if you can't be rulers. The next mention of Chadacre Hall that is accessible to us is in the Domesday Book of 1086. The hall is recorded as being owned by the Countess of Albemarle back then. The hall changed hands over the following centuries, coming into Plampin hands in the early 1500s. We have saved records of a John Plampin born at Chadacre in 1674, and his son also John born in 1700. This John fathered the gentleman in the Gainsborough painting, also John, born in May 1727. The portrait was done when John was 25. Records show that 5 years later, John's father, his eldest brother, and eldest sister all died on the same day. One wonders if this was from an accident in a carriage. There are no records of smallpox or plague outbreaks in this year. These deaths left John of the National Gallery portrait, the next born son, in line for the inheritance of Chadacre Hall in the manor of Shimpling. Notes by the National Gallery record that Gainsborough painted Plampin on Plampin land. The gallery goes on to say, "The church tower in the background is identified as All Saints, Lawshall, about 2 miles from Chadacre Hall. John is seated on the ground, his hand tucked fashionably into his waistcoat, at ease in the land he owns. His legs are splayed in an unusual fashion, which is echoed by the limbs or branches of the tree, creating a composition with radiating spokes like a wheel. The landscape is included in the portrait to reinforce Plampin's authority and privilege as a member of the British landed gentry, which is presented as part of the natural order." Well, clearly the apothecary business was doing well. Chadacre John married Elizabeth Frances Harvey Ashton in the village of Aston by Sutton. It's a good clue that she was well-to-do, as her surname was the village name. Her father was the Reverend Honourable Henry Harvey, the first Earl of Bristol and the son of Sir John Harvey, whose line is recorded all the way back to Lord John William Harvey of 1490. Her paternal grandfather had married Elizabeth, the Countess of Bristol. Elizabeth's mother was Catherine Aston of Aston Hall. Her parents were equally well-to-do. Before we get too excited with all this aristocracy, remember this is the Chadacre Plampins, definitely related but not our direct ancestors. As mentioned before, I'm still trying to track the Chadacre son who was not a firstborn and was required to forge his own path away from the estate. Chadacre John of the Gainsborough painting had a daughter, Elizabeth, named after her mother. We are so fortunate that her future father-in-law, James Oakes, a merchant banker, kept detailed diaries. From these we can glean just what the Chadacre Plampins' life was like. Dinners with the Oakes, grand balls, and the courtship of daughter Elizabeth by Orwell, the son of diary-keeper James Oakes. Remember we spoke about the Orwell River previously. I had wondered about this guy's strange first name until I put two and two together and realized he was named after the local Orwell River. James Oakes writes that his son Orwell was absolutely besotted by Elizabeth Plampin and could not bear to be parted from her during their 2-year engagement. He writes quite proudly that Elizabeth was under no pressure to marry his son. He seems gratified it was a love match and not a transaction, especially as Elizabeth was considered a financial and social catch. The fathers of the courting couple clearly discussed dowries before the wedding was agreed to. Tuesday, February 1795. I rode over this morning and paid a visit to old Mr. Plampin of Chadacre, passed an hour with him and returned home to dinner. Mr. P. gave me his most faithful of intentions and determination of doing the same by Miss P. as his other daughters. All this is lovely, but we learned from James Oakes's diaries that all was not well within the Plampin family, however. Tuesday, 4 July 1797. Son Orwell and his wife to dine at Chadacre. A general family meeting, including Reverend John Plampin, his wife, and Captain Robert Plampin and family. An accommodation took place throughout the family with every promising appearance of restoring unanimity and harmony to this, for some years back, much divided family. And a week later, Tuesday, 11th of July, 1797, son Orwell had Mr. Plampin, Reverend and Mrs. John Plampin, Mr. Robert Plampin, Mr. and Mrs. Macklin, Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, all dined, being the reconciliation family meeting at their house. How intriguing! What was behind the significant fallout between the brothers and sisters of Elizabeth of Chadacre? Sadly, no records could be found to fill in this gap, but there may be a hint in Elizabeth's brother's story. We dedicate an entire episode to Robert Plampin due to his rich story. It wasn't all fights and squabbles, though. Thursday, 1st November 1798. A grand ball to commemorate the late glorious naval viceroys. Every gentleman within 10 miles of Bury St. Edmund to be a subscriber. 3 principal gentlemen were appointed acting managers, Captains Pettiwood, Plampin, and Bengerfold. There were present 223 ladies and gents of the first fashion and distinction, a most splendid appearance as was ever remembered upon any occasion. I can just hear the swish of the ball gowns. This entry highlights the Plampin association with the Navy, something that was to continue right down to my father. Chadacre Robert, a sister of Elizabeth, was also attached to the Navy at 13, as was the custom for sons not in direct line of inheritance. He steadily worked his way up to the officer ranks. On the 15th of November 1781, Robert passed his lieutenant exams and was confirmed in the rank on 3rd of December. And in an indication of the trust between the Chadacres and the Oakes, In that same year, Robert welcomed young Orwell Oakes, then 13 years of age, to begin his training in the Navy on Robert's ship, HMS Leucadia, stationed in Newfoundland. Unbeknown to either of them then, Orwell would go on to marry Robert's sister Elizabeth. We'll give Robert Plampin his own episode, as he was a most interesting man who led a very colourful life. Unfortunately, although he married, he died childless in 1834. Reasons for this childlessness might emerge in his story. At his death, Chadacre Hall was put up for sale, rather than being passed on to near relatives. Curious. The hall and the estate was next bought by the Halifax family of banking fame. At the time of their purchase, the estate consisted of 1,200 acres, 22 farms, and 54 houses. The Halifax family added other houses, the school and the schoolhouse. Chadacre went up for sale again in 1918. It was bought by the Earl of A.V. of the renowned Guinness family. He was deeply interested in agriculture and its challenges. He founded and endowed the Chadacre Agricultural Institute in 1920 on the estate. This institute was one of the first of its kind in the country and aimed to address the problems faced by the agricultural industry and provide training for future agricultural leaders. The Earl was a deeply philanthropic man. He recognized the sons of local farm workers and farmers could not afford training fees, and that training was a route to an improved industry and better standards of living. As such, the 2-year agricultural course was free, offered to locals after an interview process. I find this story so fascinating. In the same year that the Chadacre Agricultural Institute was open, Seal Hain Agricultural College started in Newton Abbot, Devon, with similar aims. By the time I worked for Seal Hain, it had evolved into a university faculty. You might not know that I have a diploma in agriculture, and I had just written a similar agricultural diploma course for a South African college before moving to England, so I was delighted to get a job with the head of research at Seal Hain once we landed in Devon. I have very happy memories overseeing all the PhD projects happening at Seal Hain. It operated as a commercial and research farm. I felt completely in my element. I had no idea it had started at the same time a similar training institute on land that had close ties to my family had started. Back to the Chadacre Agricultural Institute. The demand for residential agricultural courses waned over the 1970s and into the early 1980s. The institute was closed and farming operations ceased in 1989. The estate was reluctantly put up for sale. A trust was formed to manage the original endowment by way of grants and scholarships, so the educational side of the institute could continue, which it does to this day. The next buyer of Chadacre was David Hart in 1989. He was known as a flamboyant banking heir who was an aide to Margaret Thatcher. He made his name as the political fixer, becoming the scourge of Arthur Scargill, who was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers. Arthur led the 1980 miners' strike against the British government's closing of coal mines. David Hart bankrolled the breaking of the strike. Ironically, he did this from his luxury suite at Claridge's, presenting as a man totally out of touch with the devastating impact of mine closures on the miners. He lived a lavish and ostentatious lifestyle, entertaining the rich and powerful, and supporting 2 mistresses and 2 sons in luxury. The Independent newspaper, when writing his obituary, reported, "At Chadacre Hall, Hart's 18th century Suffolk estate, which he restored at great expense to more than its original glory, there were all the trappings of a man who had rubbed shoulders with the world's movers and shakers. In his downstairs toilet, pictures of Hart with the British Army in the Balkans, or standing beside an RAF fighter were interspersed with political cartoons, original artwork for anti-European Union advertising, and, in pride of place above the cistern, a letter from the Soviet Politburo authorizing a payment from the Kremlin to Arthur Scargill. At David Hart's death in 2010, Chadacre Hall once again came up for sale. It was bought by a multi-million British oil tycoon, paying 50% more than the asking price to secure the property, described at the time as one of Suffolk's finest estates. Stephen Lamprell was so determined to own Chadacre that he successfully bid £16 million, believed to be £8 million more than the asking price. It was reported at the time that Mr. Lamprell was 178th on the rich list, with a fortune of £300 million. He had accumulated his wealth from oil and shipping. He still lives in and works from the Middle East with his wife Gillian. At the time of the sale, Chadacre was described as follows. The Chadacre estate surrounds the Grade II listed Regency mansion, designed by the Duke of Wellington's own architect, Philip Hardwick. It includes traditional parkland, formal gardens, terraces, and a walled garden, 415 acres of arable land, farmed organically under contract. It has a 2-acre lake for coarse fishing and a challenging family shoot. Before we finally close the door on Chadacre Estate, there is still the story of Robert Plampin to tell. There is so much more to Robert than his childless demise that led to Chadacre Hall going out of Plampin's hands. Robert's story follows in episode 6. Strap yourself in for a rollicking tale.